It's good to see all of you. Go ahead and open up your Bible, please. Hebrews chapter 6. Hebrews chapter 6. We're continuing our journey through the book of Hebrews. In the last lesson, we saw that the author of Hebrews was trying to encourage his audience to press on to maturity so that they would ultimately remain faithful to Jesus. Because that was something that these Christians were struggling with. They were struggling with remaining faithful to Jesus because of persecution and just different things, societal pressures, family pressures. Some of their families might have disowned them. They were getting kicked out of the workplace, kicked out of the shops, and different things. And so because of this, they're thinking about leaving the Lord. And here in the section that we're going to go through today, we're going to cover a wide swath. We're going to cover essentially chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 6, verse 13 and following till we get to chapter 8 is what we're going to cover this morning. But what he does in this section is he gives his audience two reasons to remain hopeful. Two reasons to hang on to hope. And so I just want to read a little bit the first section here. Hebrews chapter 6, we're going to read picking up in verse 13. It says, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, 'Surely I will bless you and multiply you.' And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves. And in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have a strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And so here the author tells us that we have two reasons in verse 17 and 18, two unchangeable things, which leads us to hold fast to the hope that is set before us. And there's a lot, I went way too far. This remote's a little weird. But the author says there are two reasons, two unchangeable reasons, two things that gives us hope. Two things that we can hold on to. This is what we're going to talk about in the lesson this morning. There's a lot of debate on those two things. What exactly are those two unchangeable things that the author of Hebrews references in verse 18? And let me just say that reasonable people can have different views on this. It's not totally clear in the text, and I don't really want to get into that debate. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm just going to give you two things. Two things that we find here in the text, and maybe they're what the author of Hebrews is talking about in verse 18, but these are two things that are unchangeable, and that should give us hope and give us reason to hang on to our faith. And so that's what we're going to talk about in the lesson this morning, two unchangeable things. Number one is we have an unchangeable God. That's what the text says in verse 17, isn't it? So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. Here we see that our God has an unchangeable character. He has an unchangeable purpose. We have reason to hold on to hope because we have an unchangeable God. The author begins this point looking back to Abraham. And so verses 13 to 15, it reads, "When God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, 'Surely I will bless you and multiply you.' And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise." The author here, he's referencing Genesis chapter 22. And so you just turn back to the book of Genesis. We'll be there. Leave your bookmark in Hebrews 6. But we'll be in the book of Genesis for a little while. And the author, he's referencing Genesis 22. In Genesis 22, Abraham is told to sacrifice his son Isaac. God tells Abraham, "Sacrifice your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love." And so Abraham goes to do just that. And he doesn't withhold Isaac. But God stops Abraham before he makes the sacrifice. It was a test for Abraham. And so here we pick up in verse 15 of Genesis 22, what Ryan read earlier. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." And so Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. And so here God says, "By myself I have sworn." That's what the author of Hebrews is referencing whenever he says he had no one greater to swear by, so he swore by himself. God says, "By myself I have sworn," and God makes these promises to Abraham concerning his offspring. But that's not the first time God had made those promises, is it? It starts in Genesis 12, doesn't it? Genesis 12 in verse 1. It's the first time that God speaks to Abram. It was his name at the time. It's the first time that God speaks to Abram, and he tells Abram, "All right, Abram, leave your family, leave your house, leave your country, and go." And Abraham goes. We'll pick up in verse 1, Genesis 12. "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And so Abram went, as the Lord had told him. And Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And so here we see that Abram is 75 years old whenever God makes this promise about offspring to him. And the text of Hebrews says that he waited patiently to receive that promise. And we know from Abraham's story that he did wait patiently. Does anyone remember how many years Abraham waited from that first promise when he was 75 years old to whenever he finally has Isaac? 25 years. He waited a long time for God to fulfill this promise. And whenever we look at Abraham's story, we see that there were just so many ups and downs. His life was like our lives. He struggled with his faith at times. As a matter of fact, in Genesis 12, he does so good. God tells him, leave your family, leave your father's house, leave your home country, and go to the land that I will show you. And then the next thing that the text says, so he went. It's like, this is potentially the first time God has ever spoken to Abraham. It's the first time we see it in Scripture. And so God is speaking to Abraham for the first time, and he says, just leave your family. That's a big deal in the ancient world. And Abraham listens to God. What great faith. But then later on in chapter 12, what do we see? Well, there's this famine in the land. And so Abraham and Sarah, they have to go to Egypt. And Abram is afraid because Sarah's beautiful, and he says, you're beautiful, and that's probably always a good way to start off a conversation with your wife. You're beautiful, and so we're gonna make this story up because people are gonna kill me because you're beautiful, and they're gonna kill me and take you. And so let's just lie and say, you're my sister. And you have to wonder what's going on in Abram's mind at the moment, because what did God promise? I'm going to bless you. I'm going to keep you safe. You're going to have plenty of children. Your children are going to become this great nation, and they will bless the entire earth. That's what God promised. So what was Abraham thinking here? Maybe he was thinking God changed his mind. I don't know. God's not going to protect me in Egypt. I don't know. And so through this experience in Genesis chapter 12, Abram had to learn that God is the unchangeable God who keeps his promises. And we see something similar in Genesis chapter 16. We can turn there. Genesis chapter 16, we'll pick up reading from verse 1. They still hadn't had children at this point. Verse 1, it says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai." So Sarah here, she says, look, God has prevented me from having children. Maybe she thinks God has sort of changed his mind on the whole promise thing. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to have children through my servant. That's the way this is going to work. And Abram listened to her. As a matter of fact, the text says Abram listened to the voice of Sarah, his wife. And by the way, that's how we know that Abram and Sarah should not have done this. That's how we know this was sort of a breach in faith. Because where was the last time that we heard this language and he listened to the voice of his wife? Where's the last time we heard that? Adam and Eve. It's kind of like a hyperlink back to Adam and Eve. In Genesis 3, God says to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. And so that's sort of like a hyperlink back to Adam and Eve. And essentially God is saying, you shouldn't have done this. And that's the lesson. Never listen to your wife. I'm kidding. But the point is, Adam and Abram, they were supposed to be leaders. And in both of those situations, their wife wanted to do something that it was a breach of faith. A breach of faith in God. And so they should have been leaders and said, no, we're going to trust in God. That's the point. And so Abram had his ups and downs. He had to go through these ups and downs to ultimately learn that God is the unchangeable God who keeps his promises. And ultimately, this culminates in Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22, when God tests Abram with regard to Isaac and sacrificing Isaac, I'm going to pick up in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. And so here in these first couple of verses, God is like just piling on. He says, take your son, and not just your son, take your only son, because at this point he had sent Ishmael away. So Isaac was the only one. So take your son, not just your son, your only son, not just your only son whom you love, and go and offer him as a burnt offering. And so God is testing Abraham here at this moment. And what does Abraham do? Kind of reminds us of Genesis chapter 12. When God says, I want you to leave your family, leave your country, leave everything you know and go. And so Abraham went. That's exactly what happens here. I want you to offer as a burnt offering your son Isaac in verse 3. So Abraham arose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and he arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. And then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy, that's important, I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And so Abraham has learned his lesson by this point. Abraham, as we know, passes the test. But Abraham, at this point in the story, it seems to me that Abraham knows that this God is the unchangeable God. God has promised that the blessing will flow through Isaac. God has promised that. And so Abraham says, we're going to go up to this mountain and we're going to come back to you. Abraham, at this point in the story, knows that God is the unchangeable God and that he was going to keep his promise. And so Abraham held fast to hope. And that's the lesson for us as well. The lesson for us is we have an unchangeable God who keeps his promises. And shouldn't that give us hope? I mean, just think of the promises that God has made to us, his people. So many great promises. There are so many things that we are looking forward to. Turn to Romans chapter 8 with me, please. Romans chapter 8. In this context, at least the context that we're going to read, Paul is talking about the hope that is laid before us. And the author of Hebrews says that Abram patiently waited and received the promise. Paul uses the same language here in this context. Romans chapter 8, we'll pick up in verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And so Paul starts off this context by saying, yes, we suffer in this present time. We live, for my hyperlinks class, in the wilderness. We suffer at this present time, but this suffering isn't worth comparing to the glory that's going to be revealed. There's something in front of us. We have a hope waiting for us, is what Paul starts off saying. Verse 19, For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. I think that references Adam and Eve back in Genesis 3. Because you have sinned, cursed is the ground because of you. The earth was made futile, and so the earth also, creation also groans and also hopes. Verse 21, actually let's pick up in verse 20 again. For creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself would be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we eagerly wait for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But we hope for what we do not see. We wait for it with patience. And so Paul tells us that we are longing for, we are looking forward to the redemption of our bodies. That's what God has promised. I mean, we live in the tent, Paul says in the book of 2 Corinthians. And in this tent, tents are not always nice, guys. You know, some of these tents are nice these days, you know, modern technology and everything. But what's better, a tent or a house? In this tent, we groan. We suffer in this broken world, in this broken body. But Paul says God is going to fix it. Our bodies are going to be redeemed. And that's what we hope for. And Paul says we wait for it with patience. And so in the book of Hebrews, the author of Hebrews says, Abraham waited patiently and he received the promise. And so we wait patiently until we receive the promise as well. And so we need to hold fast to hope. Why? Well, because we have an unchanging God who keeps his promises. Let me give you one more reason. I'm just having a 2-point lesson today. I guess I'll be a little bit weird this week. So only 2 points. Unchanging God. Number 2, we have an unchangeable high priest. In this section, the author of Hebrews moves on. He talks about Jesus. Jesus being after the order of Melchizedek. And there's a lot to talk about with regards to the order of Melchizedek. You know, and I'm not going to talk about all that this morning. I want to talk about, one of the main points that the author means whenever he says Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And if you want to know more about that, if you have any burning questions about the order of Melchizedek, just ask Max. Or you can ask Aaron or me as well, because there's a lot to talk about, but we just don't have the time to get into that. I have 13 minutes left, and I have a long point. This is the longer point than the other one. And so let's pick up in verse 19 of chapter 6, Hebrews chapter 6. Verse 19, it says, we have this as a sure and steadfast anchor for the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness. And then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. And so the author here, he tells us a lot about Melchizedek. He says Melchizedek is the king of righteousness. That's what his name means in Hebrew. He tells us that he's the king of peace. That's what Salem means in Hebrew. Shalom. Shalom means peace, and so Salem means peace. Same consonants. And so he's like Jesus in that regard. Jesus is the king of righteousness. He's also the king who brings peace. But what I want to focus on is verse 3. Verse 3 here of chapter 7. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. And so the author tells us that Melchizedek doesn't have father, mother, end of life, beginning of life. He continues a priest forever. I want to take some time to explain this, because the author is not trying to say that Melchizedek literally didn't have a father or mother. And he's not trying to say that Melchizedek lived forever. That's not the point here. His point is that these things aren't recorded in Scripture for us. They're not recorded in the Old Testament. And that's a big deal. That's a big deal because for a priest, especially a Jewish priest, Genealogy was everything. The priests were from the tribe of Levi in the Old Testament. And if you couldn't prove that, if you couldn't prove you were of the tribe of Levi, if you didn't have your genealogy, then guess what? You were not a priest. And so that's huge. Priests knew their genealogy, and typically when priests were talked about, their genealogy is mentioned. They're the son of, the son of, the son of, or they'll say they're of the tribe of Levi. First of all, and furthermore, I guess, genealogy was necessary because there was something that kept happening to all the high priests. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, there was one thing that happened to every single high priest. You know what that is? They died, right? And so genealogy is necessary because genealogy enabled the priesthood to go to the next generation. And so with the genealogy, you could transfer the priesthood, especially the high priesthood, to the next generation. It could pass from one generation to the next. And so since Genesis doesn't record that for Melchizedek, the author of Hebrews tells us that his priesthood doesn't need to be passed on to the next generation. His priesthood is a one-person priesthood, an eternal priesthood. And in the same way, Jesus has an eternal priesthood as well that doesn't need to be passed on to the next generation. His priesthood is an eternal, one-person priesthood. And because of that, it's greater than what we see in the Old Testament. Let me try and explain this. I'm sure all of us remember sort of our school days, and I'm sure all of us had that great teacher one year, probably multiple years. We had really good teachers. But imagine if you just had that really good math teacher or science teacher or English teacher or whatever it may be. Imagine you just had a great teacher, and then you notice, oh no, the year's about to end. I wonder who's going to be my next math teacher. I hope it's not Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. And so you worry because you have this really awesome teacher, but you know Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so is in the next grade above, and you're like, I really hope I don't get them as a teacher. Or, if you're in the business world and you have this awesome supervisor, they just get it, but then they retire, and you're like, oh man, I hope they don't replace him with that guy over there or that woman over there, right? It's sort of that thing. The Israelites, because the high priest would die, the Israelites might have had a really awesome high priest for, a number of years. But then they're like, oh, he's getting old. And his son is super spoiled. I really hope his son doesn't become high priest. It's sort of one of those things. That's how it could be under the Old Testament law. And the author of Hebrews is reminding us that as Christians, we don't have to go through this. Because we have an eternal high priest. An eternal high priest who is a good high priest. It'd be different if we had an eternal high priest who was a wicked high priest. But we have an eternal high priest who is a good high priest. And he's not going to need to be replaced. He's not going to die and go off. He's not going to retire and go to Florida. He's an eternal high priest. He'll always be there for us. Verse 15 now of Hebrews chapter 7. I want to cement this with Scripture. Verse 15 of Hebrews chapter 7. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not on the basis of legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. Jesus is the unchanging high priest. For it is witnessed of him, you are priests forever after the order of Melchizedek. And then jumping down to verse 23. The former priests were many in number, because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. He is the unchangeable high priest. Verse 26. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priest. But the word of the oath, by the way, you are high priest after the order of Melchizedek. In the original context of, I think, Psalm 110, God says, I swear. It's God's oath. Verse 28, but the law appoints men in their weakness as a high priest, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son that has been made perfect forever. Jesus is our good high priest forever. And so that's a lesson for us. We have an unchangeable high priest. And do you see how this gives us hope? You see that? We talked a couple weeks ago now about how we can approach God's throne with a bold frankness because Jesus understands. Hebrews 4 and verse 14, it says, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." We have a merciful, sympathetic high priest. And Hebrews 7 tells us that he's not going anywhere. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us? Have you ever felt like Christ was just done with you because of all the mistakes that you've made? Like you think to yourself, look, if I were Jesus, I wouldn't forgive me. And so surely he's done with me and all the mistakes that I've made. Have you ever felt that way? The author of Hebrews would tell us that Jesus is the unchangeable, the unchanging high priest. And he is always ready to be merciful to those who return to him. He is always ready to show forgiveness to those who return to him. He's not going to change his mind. And so if you've ever felt that way, God is just done with me, it's not true. We have an unchanging God. We have an unchanging high priest. But let me ask this question. Have you ever gone through so much that you felt like Christ has just left you? I found this comment on an internet forum. It reads, "After 13 years of trials and difficulties in life, I'm starting to lose my faith in God. I still pray because I'm told to do so, but I don't feel the same trust that God wants to help me. I feel abandoned and lost. What should I do?" This person feels like God, that Christ, has left them. And that's probably what some of the Jewish Christians felt as well. They were probably thinking to themselves, wait, Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and all of his enemies have been, placed under his feet as a footstool. So why am I suffering? It's because God has left me? And sometimes we feel that way as well. The author of Hebrews will remind us we have an unchangeable high priest. And he's not leaving. He's not going anywhere. Even whenever we go through persecution, even whenever we go through the storms of life, he's with us. As a matter of fact, the last chapter of the book of Hebrews, the author says, he suffered outside the gate, and we go with him. And so he's with us, even when we suffer. We have an unchangeable high priest. He's not going anywhere. He has an unchangeable character. He's always going to be there for us. I feel like we've all gone through those times where we feel like we're on like a rocky boat. I feel like we've all, if you live long enough anyway, we've gone through those times where it's like your soul is shaken. The author of Hebrews says this: "We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." We have an anchor of the soul, someone who can keep us steady during those storms of life. We have every reason to hold fast to hope. Why? We have an unchangeable God. We have an unchangeable high priest. That's the lesson. Thank you for listening. And offer the invitation. Maybe there's someone here this morning who has left the Lord. They've left the Lord, but you realize God is right there waiting for you because we have an unchangeable God and you want to return to him. We'd love to help you with that this morning. Or maybe there's someone who wants to dedicate their life to Christ. They want to become a Christian and have Christ as the everlasting mediator for them.